The soft hum of the computer fan was the only noise in Mark's dimly lit room. It was 2:34 a.m., and his eyes burned from hours of scrolling through mundane pages of the internet. Despite the warnings from his friends and his own creeping sense of dread, he found himself drawn to the hidden corners of the dark web, yearning for a thrill. Tonight was different. Tonight he planned to explore something truly forbidden. He clicked on a thread labeled The Silent Market. A shiver ran down his spine as he read the brief description. A place for those who seek knowledge, whispers, and secrets meant to stay buried. The allure was undeniable, a morbid curiosity that tightened around him like a cold, invisible chain. With a shaky breath, he followed the link. The site loaded slowly, every second making him more anxious. Finally, the screen displayed a simple black background with stark white text. A chat box popped up. The message read, "Welcome, Seeker. What do you desire?" Mark hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He typed, "I'm just here to observe." The response came almost instantly. "There is a price for every eye that watches." The cursor blinked at him expectantly. Nervously, he typed back, "I'll pay the price." He knew it was just a game, some elaborate hoax created to scare people like him, but a gnawing unease settled in his gut. Payment accepted, the chat replied, and the website changed. The screen became a grid of video feeds, each showing a grainy, black and white scene. Mark squinted, trying to make sense of what he was watching. Some feeds showed empty rooms, swaying trees, or still highways. But then his heart began to thump harder as he recognized familiar landmarks. One video in particular made his breath hitch, his own street. The camera angle was high, maybe from a lamppost or a tree. The view was clear enough to make out his house, his window, his lit-up room. Mark stood from his chair, almost knocking it over. He rushed to the window and peeked through the blinds. The street outside was silent, shadowed, nothing moved. But the camera feed still showed his room from that same eerie vantage point. Panic coiled in his chest. He returned to the computer, heart pounding so loudly it was all he could hear. The chat box had a new message. "See something familiar?" His fingers trembled as he typed, "Who are you?" "Just a watcher like you," came the reply. Then another, "But you are more interesting than most." Mark's mouth went dry. He grabbed his phone and prepared to call the police, but as he opened it, a new video feed filled the screen. This time it was a live view of him sitting at his desk. His phone slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. The camera wasn't just outside, it was inside his room. "Enough?" he whispered, fear strangling his voice. He forced himself to shut down the browser, clicking frantically until it was gone. He turned off his computer, yanking the plug from the wall. Darkness swallowed the room, but he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, the sense that he was being watched. Then his phone vibrated. He scrambled to pick it up, his hands slick with sweat. A notification from an unknown number. "You can't just leave. Payment must be completed." A photo followed, and Mark's stomach churned. It was a picture of his parents, asleep in their bedroom, taken mere moments ago. He stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. His parents were safe, tucked away in their room upstairs. Weren't they? Without thinking, he dashed out of his room and bounded up the stairs, nearly tripping over his feet. He threw open their bedroom door. His parents lay peacefully in bed, undisturbed, but a shadow moved. Mark barely had time to register it before something ice-cold grabbed his wrist. He screamed, pulling away with all his strength, but the grip was iron. His father jolted awake, fumbling for the bedside lamp. Light spilled over the room and the shadow vanished. Mark fell backward, clutching his wrist, now marked with a bruise shaped like a handprint. "What's going on?" his dad demanded, eyes wide with alarm. Mark's lips moved, but no sound came out. He stumbled to his feet and backed away, unable to process what had just happened. Downstairs, his computer had turned back on, casting a harsh blue glow in the darkness. A new message awaited him. "The final act awaits. Watch carefully." Terrified, but unable to resist, he made his way back to the room. The video feeds were gone, replaced by one final image, a live view of his parents' room. Mark was there in the frame, standing by the door, his father awake and watching him. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, impossibly thin, and wrapped in darkness. Mark's father didn't see it until it was too late. The figure moved with inhuman speed, one bony hand covering his father's mouth, the other reaching for his mother. Mark screamed, but no sound came from his throat. In real life, he sprinted back up the stairs, bursting into the room, but it was empty. His parents were gone. The computer screen went black, a final message appearing in blood-red text, "Payment complete." Mark's vision blurred with tears as he collapsed to his knees. The only sound left in the house was his own choked sobbing, echoing through the emptiness. The watchers had taken what they were owed, and he, the curious observer, was left with nothing but the darkness and the suffocating sense that someone was still watching. The clock on Oliver's wall read 3 a.m., the witching hour. He knew it, yet he couldn't bring himself to stop browsing the obscure forums he had stumbled upon weeks ago. They called themselves The Archive, an exclusive corner of the dark web dedicated to sharing and experiencing real, unspeakable horrors. The site was nothing more than a black screen with a blinking cursor, waiting for commands. It felt like a relic from another era, something that had no place existing in the modern world. But Oliver was no stranger to the bizarre, and tonight he was in search of something unforgettable. He typed a command, "Show me something true." The cursor flickered for a moment, and then text began to appear. "True horror demands a witness. Will you become one? YN." Oliver's fingers hesitated. His heart thumped against his ribs, but he couldn't resist. He pressed Y. The screen went dark, and then, without warning, his webcam light blinked on. His own face stared back at him, pale and illuminated by the glow of the monitor. His stomach twisted. Before he could react, the screen flickered again, and his video feed was replaced by another. It was grainy, but the image was clear enough, an old, dilapidated room with peeling wallpaper and a single wooden chair in the center. The room was lit by a swinging light bulb which cast strange shadows across the floor. The words appeared slowly. "The observer must watch. Do not look away." His gut instinct told him to close the laptop and throw it across the room, but his curiosity held him captive. Then something moved in the video. A shape, hunched and shambling, emerged from the darkness, dragging itself into the light. It was a woman, or what used to be a woman. Her limbs were twisted at odd angles, and her skin hung from her bones like wet, sagging paper. The empty sockets where her eyes should have been made Oliver's blood run cold. He wanted to look away, but something kept him glued to the screen, his eyes wide with terror. The thing in the video began to sway, jerking with unnatural movements like a marionette whose strings had been tangled. Suddenly, the feed cut to black, and new words appeared. "You are now marked." Before he could process the message, his phone buzzed on his desk. His heart nearly stopped. Who could be texting him at this hour? He picked it up and saw an unknown number. The message read, "Look outside." Every nerve in his body screamed at him to ignore it, but he couldn't stop himself. He moved to the window, peeling back the curtain with trembling fingers. At first, he saw nothing. The street was empty, quiet, and bathed in the sickly yellow light of the street lamps. But then he spotted it. Standing directly beneath one of the lamps was a figure. The hunched, broken woman from the video. Her head jerked to the side, and even though she had no eyes, Oliver knew she was looking straight at him. He staggered back from the window, his chest heaving. Another text. "It's coming upstairs." The floorboards outside his room creaked, and Oliver's vision swam with fear. He backed away from the door, clutching his phone like a lifeline. Another creak, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy, dragging footsteps. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand frozen as the door handle rattled. His phone buzzed again. The text read, "You must keep watching." The door slowly opened, creaking on its hinges. Oliver didn't want to see what was on the other side, but his body moved on its own. Standing in the doorway was the woman, her twisted limbs cracking as she took a step into his room. Her mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should, and a grotesque sound poured out, a mixture of a deep guttural moan and the wet, crackling noise of tearing flesh. In a burst of desperation, Oliver turned to his computer. The screen had come back to life. A new message flashed, "Say the words and be free." He fumbled for the keyboard, hardly able to breathe. He typed, "Release me." The words vanished and the creature stopped. It cocked its head, mouth still hanging open, and then, like a marionette losing its strings, it collapsed into a pile of broken limbs. The screen went dark again. The webcam light turned off, and the silence that followed was absolute. Oliver fell to the floor, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. But relief was short-lived. His phone buzzed one last time. He picked it up with trembling hands. The message read, Witnesses are never truly free. The closet door behind him creaked open. The last thing he heard was the sound of cracking bones and the soft whisper of something unseen, laughing. The wind howled outside Adam's apartment, rattling the window panes. Rain lashed against the glass in waves, but the storm wasn't what kept him awake. No, his sleeplessness had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the email he'd received hours earlier. It was from an address he didn't recognize, with a simple subject line, "Are you ready to play?" The message inside was sparse but unsettling. "You're invited to play the door game. Follow the rules or suffer the consequences." Rule number 1, check your front door at midnight. Adam had initially brushed it off as a prank, something a friend had set up to scare him. But as the hours ticked by, he found himself unable to shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. Midnight drew closer, and his nerves twisted tighter with every second. At 11:59 p.m., the storm reached a fever pitch. Adam sat on his couch, clutching his phone and glancing nervously at the front door. He had no intention of actually participating in this so-called game, but part of him, the part that didn't want to risk anything, couldn't help but obey. 12 a.m. The digital clock on his wall let out a soft beep. Adam's heart skipped a beat. With great reluctance, he stood up, every step toward the front door feeling heavier than the last. He reached out, hesitated, then pulled it open. The hallway beyond was dark, but something lay on his doormat, a plain white envelope. He picked it up with trembling hands, the storm still raging behind him. Returning to the safety of his apartment, he tore the envelope open. Inside was a note, handwritten in elegant, looping script. Rule number 2, never look in the mirror after midnight. He swallowed, a bead of sweat running down his temple. This was getting ridiculous. Someone had to be messing with him. But before he could think too hard, he realized something horrifying. His bathroom door was ajar, and he could see a sliver of his mirror from where he stood. He rushed to close the door, but he froze mid-step. For a split second, he thought he saw movement in the mirror. Something that wasn't him, something that melted back into the shadows before he could fully comprehend it. Adam slammed the bathroom door shut, his pulse roaring in his ears. His phone buzzed, and he almost dropped it. A new message from the same unknown email address. "You're breaking the rules, Adam. Follow them, or we'll make sure you regret it." His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his phone. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He wanted to believe this was all a joke, but deep down he knew something was terribly wrong. Another note slid under his front door, this time without any prompting. He approached it cautiously, bending down to pick it up. Rule number 3, whatever happens, do not open your closet door. Adam's mouth went dry. His closet was in his bedroom, and he was certain he had left it shut. But when he looked down the hall, he noticed the bedroom door was open, just a crack. And from that sliver of space, he could see his closet door. It was open, barely an inch, but wide enough to see the darkness beyond. He forced himself to stay rooted in place. Fear pulsed through his veins like liquid ice. The storm outside seemed to mock him, each gust of wind and crack of thunder making him flinch. His phone buzzed yet again, and he almost didn't want to check it. But he did. "You're doing well," the message read, "but it's almost time for the final rule." Adam's breath came out in shallow, panicked bursts. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of movement. The anxiety was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Then the light bulb in his living room flickered. Once. Twice. Then it went out, plunging him into near darkness. A sound emerged from the hallway, a soft creaking like a door slowly opening. Adam held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. His phone buzzed one last time, the screen casting an eerie glow in the dark. Final rule, don't let it see you. His vision blurred with tears, and a cold sweat drenched his skin. A presence filled the hallway, heavy and suffocating, something that felt wrong on an elemental level. The creaking grew louder, and he knew, without needing to look, that his closet door was opening wider. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to shrink into nothingness. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, approached from the hallway. His heart pounded, so loud he was sure the thing could hear it. Shadows twisted and writhed along the walls, forming grotesque, shifting shapes. The footsteps stopped just outside his living room, and the air grew colder. Adam squeezed his eyes shut, silently praying for it to be over. The thing waited, its presence oppressive and suffocating. But then, slowly, the shadows receded. The heavy feeling lifted, and the room grew warmer. Adam dared to open his eyes, finding his living room empty. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. His phone buzzed one last time. "Congratulations," the message read. "You survived, this time." A new note slid under his door, and dread pooled in his stomach. He picked it up and read, "See you tomorrow." Somewhere in the dark, Adam heard a soft, echoing laugh. He knew then that the game was far from over. Jake had always loved exploring abandoned places. There was something thrilling about the silence, the dust, the feeling of stepping into a forgotten world. So, when his friend Trevor suggested they visit the old Fairmont Psychiatric Hospital, a sprawling complex that had been closed for decades, Jake didn't hesitate. It was a chilly, moonless night when they arrived, armed with flashlights and a camera. The hospital loomed over them, an eerie silhouette against the sky. Vines and ivy had claimed much of the building, but it still had an air of malevolence, as if it were alive and waiting. "Creepy as hell," Trevor whispered, trying to sound casual but failing. Jake smirked, though he couldn't ignore the unsettling vibe. They slipped through a gap in the rusted gate, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. Inside, the air was thick with decay, and a stale, musty scent clung to everything. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, casting elongated shadows along cracked, peeling walls. Graffiti covered almost every surface, but there were remnants of the hospital's past: broken gurneys, rusted wheelchairs, and doors hanging from their hinges. "Let's head to the main wing," Jake suggested, his voice low. Trevor hesitated but nodded. The main wing was where they'd heard most of the local ghost stories originated. Rumors of shadowy figures, whispered voices, and the spirit of a head nurse who had supposedly gone mad. They wandered through endless hallways, the silence pressing in on them. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as though the hospital was swallowing the sound. But then, just as they were about to enter the main treatment ward, Jake paused. He held up his hand to stop Trevor. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Trevor frowned, listening. The air felt heavier, and then it came, a distant, rhythmic tapping. It echoed down the hallway, faint but deliberate, like someone tapping a fingernail against metal. The two exchanged uneasy glances. "Probably just water dripping or something," Trevor offered weakly. But Jake knew the sound was too methodical, too purposeful. They crept forward, each step more hesitant than the last. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, and it led them to a wide doorway marked Treatment Room 3. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and the darkness beyond was almost impenetrable. "Should we go in?" Trevor's voice was barely more than a whisper, but Jake didn't answer. Something compelled him forward, as if the darkness itself had hooked its tendrils into his curiosity. They pushed the door open, and their flashlights swept over the large room. Rusted medical equipment was scattered across the floor, and leather straps hung limply from an old operating table in the center. But there was something else. In the corner, a figure stood with its back to them. Trevor stifled a gasp, his flashlight beam wobbling. The figure was dressed in what looked like a torn and dirty hospital gown. Its hair was matted, and its bony shoulders jutted out from the thin fabric. The rhythmic tapping continued. The figure was using its long, disjointed fingers to drum against an overturned metal tray. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice breaking. The tapping stopped. The figure went still, and for a moment the silence was deafening. Then it began to turn, slowly, its neck twisting at an unnatural angle. The beam of Jake's flashlight caught its face, and he felt his blood turn to ice. The thing had no eyes, just dark, sunken sockets. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque, lipless grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. Jake stumbled backward, and the creature let out a guttural laugh, a sound that echoed with agony and madness. Trevor grabbed Jake's arm, and they bolted from the room, their footsteps pounding down the hallway. The laughter followed them, growing louder, echoing off the walls in a horrible cacophony. They didn't stop running until they burst out of the building and into the cold night air. Only then did the laughter stop, cut off like a severed string. Jake bent over, gasping for breath, his hands shaking. Trevor was pale, wide-eyed with terror. "Let's get the hell out of here," Trevor managed, and Jake nodded. Too stunned to speak, they sprinted to their car, peeling away from the hospital as fast as possible. Neither of them looked back. But that night, as Jake lay in bed, trying to calm his frayed nerves, He heard it again, the soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the closet in his room. His heart pounded, and he pulled the covers up to his chin. The tapping grew louder, and then a familiar, guttural laugh echoed from the darkness. The last thing Jake saw before the room went pitch black was his closet door slowly creaking open. The rain poured relentlessly as Ethan drove down the deserted country road, his windshield wipers working furiously to keep up. His phone's GPS had failed half an hour ago, and he was sure he had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The forest loomed thick and black on either side of the narrow road, and the dim headlights barely pierced the heavy sheets of rain. He was completely, utterly lost. Suddenly, something flashed in his peripheral vision. A sign, barely legible, pointing toward a dirt road on the right. Fresh, Black Hollow Inn, 1 mile. Relief washed over him. An inn meant shelter, maybe even some cell service to call for help. He turned onto the dirt path, tires splashing through muddy potholes as he drove. The inn appeared out of nowhere, a hulking Victorian structure that looked like it had been yanked straight from an old horror movie. The wood siding was weathered and gray, and the windows were dark, save for a few dim lights flickering inside. Ethan pulled into the gravel driveway and sat there for a moment, his stomach twisted with unease. But he had no choice. Staying in the car all night wasn't an option. He grabbed his backpack and ran up the sagging front steps, sheltering himself from the rain as best he could. The front door was massive, with a tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a wolf's head. He raised his fist to knock, but before he could, the door creaked open. Ethan stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him. The air smelled of damp wood and something else, something faintly metallic. The lobby was dimly lit with antique furniture and a large, dusty chandelier hanging from the ceiling. A fire crackled weakly in the stone fireplace, and an old reception desk stood at the back of the room. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. A shadow shifted behind the desk, and a tall, gaunt man emerged. He was dressed in a tattered suit that might have been stylish a century ago, and his eyes were unsettlingly pale, like faded marbles. "Welcome to Black Hollow Inn," the man said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "You'll be staying the night, I presume?" Ethan hesitated. The place felt wrong, like a stage set for a nightmare, but he didn't have much of a choice. Yeah, I just need a room for the night," he replied. The man's mouth curled into something resembling a smile. "Very well. Follow me." The receptionist led Ethan up a creaking staircase, each step groaning under their weight. The hallways were lined with portraits, the subject's eyes seeming to follow them as they passed. At the end of the hall, the man stopped in front of a door and unlocked it with a skeleton key. "Room 13, he said, pushing the door open. "Enjoy your stay." His voice dripped with something unsettling, and before Ethan could respond, the man turned and disappeared down the hall. The room was sparse but functional. A bed, a wardrobe, a cracked mirror hanging above an old writing desk. Ethan dropped his backpack and tried to shake off the eerie feeling clinging to him. He peeled off his soaked jacket and sat on the edge of the bed, breathing deeply to calm his nerves. He tried his phone again, still no service. With a sigh, he walked over to the window, hoping to at least catch a view of the storm. But as he pulled back the heavy drapes, his heart sank. The window wasn't looking out onto the forest or the road. Instead, he was staring into an identical room where an old woman sat on a bed, rocking back and forth. Her face was gaunt, and her eyes were hollow pits of darkness. Before he could react, she turned her head sharply, as though sensing his presence. Her lips stretched into a smile, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. Ethan stumbled back, yanking the curtain closed, his heart thudding like a drum. What the hell had he just seen? A loud knock shattered the silence, making him jump. He turned to the door, pulse racing. "Who's there?" he called, but there was no reply. Another knock came, louder this time, and the doorknob began to rattle. Terrified, Ethan grabbed the nearest object, a brass candlestick, and held it in front of him like a weapon. The knocking stopped abruptly. A moment later, the door swung open on its own. The hallway was empty, but the chandelier in the distance flickered. A shuffling sound echoed down the corridor, coming closer. Ethan's grip tightened around the candlestick. He could see shadows moving at the far end, elongated and distorted. He stepped into the hall, heart pounding in his ears. "Hello?" he whispered. But the only response was the groan of the wooden floorboards as something dragged itself closer. His breath caught in his throat when he saw it. A figure crawling on all fours, limbs bending in unnatural ways, its head cocked at an angle that should have been impossible. Its eyes were pits of black, oozing with something thick and dark. It whispered his name, a sound like dry leaves scraping together. Ethan stumbled backward, dropping the candlestick. He rushed back into his room, slamming the door and locking it. His chest heaved, terror making his skin feel like ice. Suddenly, the wardrobe door creaked open behind him. Ethan turned slowly, dread coiling in his stomach. Two pale hands emerged, gripping the edge of the wardrobe. A face peeked out, twisted and smiling, the same old woman he had seen through the window. "Welcome to Black Hollow," she rasped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. The light bulb above him shattered, plunging the room into darkness. The last thing Ethan felt was icy, bony fingers wrapping around his throat, pulling him into the endless shadows. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the inn all was quiet once more. The only sound was the echo of a door creaking shut, and somewhere deep within the walls, a whisper of laughter lingered. The night air was thick with fog as Leah drove her old sedan down the winding, deserted road. Her headlights barely cut through the mist, and every shadow seemed to bend and twist like living things. Her GPS had given up miles ago, and the road signs were rusted and unreadable. The isolation was unnerving, but she pressed on, hoping to find a town or even a gas station. The road curved sharply, and Leah had to swerve to avoid a fallen branch. Her heart raced, and she gripped the steering wheel, trying to calm her nerves. Just as she steadied herself, her eyes caught something standing in the fog. A lone figure on the side of the road, watching her. She barely got a glimpse. A tall silhouette with no discernible features, just standing there. A chill slithered down her spine, but she told herself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the light, a shadow. But as she drove on, her unease only grew. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. She picked it up, expecting a message or some kind of notification. Instead, the screen showed an incoming call from unknown. Leah frowned, her stomach twisting. Who would be calling at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. "Hello," she said, her voice shaky. There was silence on the other end. Then a soft crackling sound, like someone was breathing shallowly into the phone. She was about to hang up when a voice finally spoke. A voice that sounded almost too close, like it was right in her ear. "Turn around," the voice whispered, thin and hollow. Leah's blood ran cold. She slammed on the brakes, her car skidding to a stop. Her hands shook as she hung up and tossed the phone onto the passenger's seat. Her headlights illuminated only the thick fog ahead, but she felt watched, as if unseen eyes were lurking in the shadows. Gathering her courage, she started the car again, heart pounding. But as she rounded the next bend, she saw something that made her stomach drop. A house stood on the side of the road, a large, decrepit mansion that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were shattered, and ivy climbed up the crumbling stone walls. Leah knew she should drive past it, keep going, but her headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. The car shuddered once, twice, and then died. "No, no, no," she whispered, desperately turning the key in the ignition. The car refused to start. A feeling of dread settled over her as she looked at the mansion. The fog was thicker here, swirling around the building like ghostly fingers. She grabbed her phone, but it was dead, the screen black. With no service, no way to call for help, and nowhere else to go, she had no choice. Leah stepped out into the fog, every hair on her body standing on end. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. She approached the mansion, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing. No response. She pushed the door open, and it groaned on its rusted hinges. The inside was as derelict as the exterior, dusty furniture covered in white sheets, cobwebs draped across the ceiling, and an air of desolation that made her skin crawl. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Leah spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The doorknob wouldn't budge, as if the house had locked her in. Panic clawed at her, but she forced herself to stay calm. As she turned back to the hall, she noticed something on the floor. Footprints. Fresh, muddy footprints leading deeper into the mansion. Leah's breath caught, and she knew she wasn't alone. She followed the prints despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The footprints led to a large staircase, and she could hear faint creaking coming from upstairs, as if someone or something was walking around. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. The upper hallway was lined with doors, all closed except one at the far end. Light spilled from the open doorway, and shadows danced along the wall, flickering like a broken film reel. Leah swallowed, her mouth dry. She approached the room, peering inside. The room was empty, save for a single rocking chair which moved back and forth on its own. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the floor was a message, scrawled in something dark and wet. "Welcome home." Leah stumbled back, her pulse racing. She turned to leave, but she froze when she saw a figure standing in the hallway behind her. It was the same tall silhouette she had seen on the road. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. The figure raised an arm, pointing at her. The walls began to creak, and the light bulbs flickered and shattered, plunging the house into darkness. Leah screamed and ran, stumbling down the stairs, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The front door was still locked, but she grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and swung it at the window. The glass shattered, and she threw herself outside, landing hard on the wet ground. Scrambling to her feet, she raced back to her car, the mansion looming behind her. She fumbled with the door, practically throwing herself inside. When she tried the ignition again, the engine roared to life. Without looking back, she sped away, the fog swallowing the mansion as though it had never existed. Her hands were still shaking when she finally made it back to a main road, the faint lights of a distant town guiding her. But as she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following her, lurking just out of sight in the rearview mirror. And then, as she glanced into the mirror, her heart stopped. The silhouette was sitting in the back seat, eyes glowing faintly, a smile spreading across a face that shouldn't have been human. The last thing Leah heard was the sound of her own scream, echoing into the foggy night. Danny had always loved camping. The idea of getting away from the noise of the city and being surrounded by nothing but nature was comforting to him. So when his friends canceled on their annual trip to Black Ridge Forest at the last minute, he decided to go alone. He packed his gear, grabbed his trusty flashlight, and set off for a weekend of solitude. The first day was peaceful. The sun shone through the canopy of towering trees, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine. Danny set up his tent near a secluded part of the forest, where a narrow stream whispered over rocks. He spent the day hiking, taking in the sights and sounds of nature, and by evening he had a small campfire crackling away. Night fell quickly, and the forest became a different world. The once friendly woods now seemed oppressive, shadows stretching out like grasping hands. Danny didn't mind, though. He had always loved the quiet of the forest at night, the way the darkness blanketed everything in mystery. But as he sat by the fire, something felt off. It was too quiet. The usual chorus of crickets and rustling leaves had vanished. He strained his ears, trying to catch any sound. That's when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic knocking coming from deep within the woods. Thump, thump, thump. Danny shivered and told himself it was probably just a woodpecker or a branch knocking in the wind. But the sound was too steady, too deliberate. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it toward the trees, but the beam illuminated nothing but dense forest. Shaking off the unease, he tried to focus on his fire, hoping the noise would stop. But the knocking grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was moving through the woods toward his camp. Thump, thump. Hello? Danny called out, his voice cracking slightly. No answer. He stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He tried to laugh off the tension, telling himself he was overreacting. But then he saw it. Something moved in the darkness, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. It was a figure, tall and thin, swaying slightly. Danny's heart pounded and he stumbled back. The figure stepped forward and he finally got a better look. Its face was wrong. A twisted smile stretched impossibly wide, teeth glinting in the light. The eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. The figure wore what looked like tattered, old-fashioned clothing hanging from its skeletal frame, and it kept knocking, one hand tapping a rhythm against a tree trunk. Thump! Danny's breath caught in his throat. The The thing tilted its head as though curious, and then, with a sudden, jerky motion, it lunged toward him. Danny dropped his flashlight in his panic, the beam spinning wildly before landing on the ground, casting long shadows. He didn't think. He just ran. The forest seemed to close in around him, branches clawing at his clothes and face. His feet pounded the ground, his only goal to get as far away as possible. The knocking continued, echoing through the trees, now accompanied by the sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling. It was following him. Danny burst into a clearing and nearly collapsed, gasping for air. He looked around, but the thing was nowhere in sight. The forest was silent again, the only sound his ragged breathing. His relief was short-lived. A soft whisper drifted through the air, a voice like dry leaves scraping together. Danny. He whipped around, but no one was there. Panic surged through him. How did it know his name? He backed away, his legs trembling, and nearly screamed when something grabbed his ankle. He looked down, expecting to see a hand, but there was nothing. He stumbled backward, landing hard on the forest floor. The whispering grew louder, and the air around him turned freezing cold. His breath came out in white puffs, and frost began to spread across the ground. Then he saw them, shadows emerging from the trees, dozens of figures with hollow eyes and twisted smiles, all swaying in unison. They began to speak, their voices overlapping, a horrifying chorus. "You're not supposed to be here." Danny scrambled to his feet and ran again, the figures watching him, their heads turning to follow his movement. He ran until his lungs burned, until he could barely stand, and finally, he saw the lights of his campsite. His fire had died down to embers, but it was the only familiar thing left in this nightmare. He collapsed next to his tent, heart pounding, and grabbed his car keys. He wasn't staying another second. Throwing his gear haphazardly into his backpack, he prepared to leave when he heard the knocking again, right behind him. Thump, thump, thump. Slowly, he turned around. The figure from before stood inches away, smiling that grotesque smile. Its hand reached out, bony fingers stretching toward his face. Danny screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and everything went dark. When he woke up, the sun was rising, painting the forest in soft, golden light. Danny was lying next to the dead campfire, his heart still pounding in his chest. Everything seemed normal. The trees, the distant sound of birdsong, the morning mist rising from the ground. Had it all been a nightmare? A hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? He packed up quickly, not wanting to spend another minute in Black Ridge Forest. As he loaded his gear into his car, he glanced at the tree where he had first heard the knocking. His blood went cold. Carved into the bark were the words, "See you again soon, Danny." With shaking hands, he got into his car and sped down the dirt road, vowing never to return. But even as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, something that now knew his name and had marked him. And somewhere deep in the forest, the knocking continued. James had always been a night owl, a habit born out of late nights studying or playing video games. But nothing in his life could have prepared him for the night he spent in his grandmother's house, a place he remembered fondly from childhood visits. When she passed away, the old Victorian house fell to his family, and his parents sent him there to catalog her belongings before they put the house up for sale. The house stood at the edge of a quiet town, its wooden siding painted a faded yellow, and the windows framed with weathered white shutters. James arrived late in the afternoon, and by the time he settled in and made himself some dinner, darkness had settled over the countryside. The house creaked and groaned as old houses do, but it had a certain charm, a nostalgia that almost put him at ease. Almost. It was just after midnight when he heard the first sound, a faint tapping coming from upstairs. He paused, setting his laptop down and listening intently. The house was filled with antiques, so he brushed it off as a loose window rattling in the wind. Still, something about the noise unsettled him, a rhythmic pattern that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. Tap, tap, tap. James frowned. The tapping continued, and it seemed to be coming from his grandmother's old room at the end of the hall. He hadn't ventured into that room yet. There was something about it that made him feel uneasy, even during the day. He grabbed his flashlight, his pulse quickening. Each step he took on the creaking wooden floor felt like a countdown to something he couldn't name. The hallway stretched before him, dark and shadowed as he made his way to the closed door of his grandmother's room. The tapping stopped. James hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know what was on the other side, but he had to see for himself. Slowly, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was as he remembered it, dusty, cluttered with lace doilies and porcelain dolls that stared blankly from every shelf and corner. The air was thick, stale, as if the room had been holding its breath. He shined his flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place. Sighing in relief, he was about to leave when he noticed something odd. One of the dolls, a large one with painted blue eyes and a porcelain face cracked down the middle, had moved. He was certain of it. It now sat on the edge of the bed, its head tilted, as if listening. James swallowed hard. "Just my imagination," he muttered. He backed out of the room, closing the door firmly behind him, and returned to the living room. He tried to focus on his laptop again, but the house seemed darker, the shadows thicker. Then he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it came from the living room window. James froze, his breath catching. The window faced the garden outside, but he knew it was too dark to see much beyond the glass. Still, he forced himself to look. Heart pounding, he turned toward the window and lifted his flashlight, shining the beam out into the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing but his own pale reflection. Then a face appeared. It pressed itself against the glass, a white, featureless mask that seemed to melt and reform, its mouth opening into a silent scream. James stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his grasp. The light rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows around the room. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as he grabbed his keys and made a beeline for the front door. But before he could reach it, the tapping started again, louder, now coming from the front door itself. He stopped in his tracks, fear freezing him in place. The doorknob rattled as if someone or something was trying to get inside. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence, heavy and suffocating. James stood there, every muscle in his body tense. He reached for his phone, only to realize he had left it upstairs in his grandmother's room. He cursed under his breath. Whatever was happening, he needed to get out of this house. Summoning what little courage he had left, he stepped forward. The air seemed to thicken around him, pressing down like an invisible weight. As he passed the staircase, he glanced upward, and his heart nearly stopped. The dolls from his grandmother's room were standing on the stairs. Every single one of them lined up like silent sentinels, their glassy eyes fixed on him. Some of their heads were tilted at unnatural angles, and the large doll with the cracked face stood at the front, her expression almost mocking. James stumbled backward, terror flooding his veins. The dolls began to move, their limbs jerking like marionettes, stepping down the stairs one by one. He turned and ran, crashing through the front door and out into the cold night. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. Fumbling with the keys, he managed to get inside and lock the doors. His hands were shaking as he started the engine, his eyes fixed on the house. The front door was wide open, and the shadows inside seemed to move, shifting as if something watched him from within. He didn't wait to see what would come next. He sped away, the house disappearing behind him in the rearview mirror. Only when he reached the safety of a well-lit gas station did he finally stop to catch his breath. James tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the dark, the stress of being alone in that house. But even as he sat there, the memory of the tapping and those lifeless porcelain eyes haunted him. He didn't go back to his grandmother's house after that. And sometimes, late at night, he still heard the faintest echo of a tap-tap outside his window, a chilling reminder that some things should be left undisturbed. It was a bitterly cold December evening when Samuel's phone buzzed with a message from his old high school friend, Peter. Peter had always been the kind of person who lived for thrills, the one who would dare everyone to do the stupidest things just to get a laugh or a scare. This time, he had a new adventure. A supposedly haunted, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. "We have to check it out," the message read. "Meet me there at 11. Bring a flashlight." Samuel hesitated. He had heard the stories about St. Vincent's Hospital. Once a bustling medical facility, it had been shut down abruptly decades ago under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors of botched surgeries, ghostly apparitions, and people hearing strange whispers when they ventured too close. He wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but something about the idea of going there at night made his skin crawl. Still, he wasn't about to let Peter think he was a coward. So at 10:45, he bundled up, grabbed his flashlight, and drove through the empty streets toward the old hospital. As he neared, the massive, decaying structure loomed out of the darkness, its broken windows gaping like black, empty eyes. Weeds and vines had overtaken the parking lot, and rusted medical equipment lay scattered around the grounds. Peter was already there, pacing around his beat-up truck, his breath fogging in the cold. "Took you long enough," he joked, though his grin didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ready to do some ghost hunting?" Samuel forced a laugh, but his heart was already thudding. The two of them approached the main entrance, their footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. The front doors were slightly ajar, creaking ominously in the wind. Peter pushed them open, and they stepped inside. The interior was pitch black, and the air felt damp and heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Graffiti covered the walls, and broken glass crunched under their feet. Their flashlight beams danced across abandoned hospital beds, shattered light fixtures, and old medical charts scattered across the floor. "This place is a dump," Peter said, his voice louder than it needed to be, as if he were trying to scare off whatever spirits might be lurking. "But creepy, right?" Samuel shivered and nodded, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The hospital was silent, save for the occasional drip of water from a leaky ceiling and the groan of the old building settling. They made their way deeper into the maze-like hallways, the silence pressing in on them. Then they heard it, a faint, wheezing sound like someone struggling to breathe. Both of them froze, exchanging a wide-eyed glance. "Did you hear that?" Samuel whispered. Peter's bravado slipped for just a moment. "Probably just a raccoon or something," he said, though his voice wavered. They continued down the hallway, and the sound grew louder. It was definitely not an animal. It sounded human, labored breathing echoing from somewhere in the darkness. Samuel's mouth went dry, and he gripped his flashlight tighter. The beam of light trembled as they rounded a corner and came a set of rusted double doors. Above the doors, a faded sign read "Intensive Care Unit." Peter pushed the doors open, and they entered what had once been a busy ICU ward. Now it was a cavernous, decaying room filled with shadows. Rusty hospital beds lay scattered, and heart monitors sat silent and dead. The breathing sound had stopped, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. Samuel swept his flashlight across the room, and that's when he saw it. One of the beds, far in the corner, was occupied. A shape lay under the thin, yellowed sheets, unmoving. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Peter, look," he whispered, pointing. Peter's face went pale. The shape under the sheets was unmistakable, a human figure, lying perfectly still. But it couldn't be real. No one had been here for decades, right? Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Peter took a step toward the bed. Samuel stayed rooted in place, dread flooding his veins. Peter reached out and pulled back the sheet. The bed was empty. A burst of laughter erupted from Peter, though it sounded forced. "See? Nothing to be afraid of," he said, but before Samuel could reply, the laughter cut off. Peter's eyes widened, and he took a shaky step back, pointing at something on the bed's metal frame. Samuel aimed his flashlight, and his heart lurched. There were handprints smeared on the rusted metal, fresh and wet, as if someone had just been lying there. The two friends backed away, but before they could get far, they heard another sound. It started as a faint murmur, growing louder, like a chorus of voices whispering at once. The sound filled the room, rising and falling as though the very walls were breathing. "Time to go," Peter said, his voice cracking. They turned and bolted for the doors, but as they reached the hallway, the lights above them flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked tiles. Shadows stretched and twisted, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Samuel risked a glance back and nearly tripped. The shadows were moving, detaching from the walls and floor, swirling together into a figure, a tall, dark shape that radiated a sense of pure, malevolent dread. It took a step toward them. "Run!" Peter screamed, and they sprinted down the hall, their footsteps echoing as they weaved through the maze of corridors. The whispers chased them, the sound wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. They burst out of the main entrance, slamming the doors behind them, and didn't stop running until they reached Peter's truck. They jumped inside, locking the doors and starting the engine. Peter floored the gas, and they sped away, the hospital shrinking into the distance behind them. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the whispers still echoing in their ears. Finally, Peter broke the silence. "We are never coming back here. Ever." Samuel could only nod, his hands still shaking. The whole experience felt like a nightmare, something he hoped to forget. But as he looked down at his own hands, his stomach twisted in terror. There, smeared across his palm, was a fresh, rust-red handprint.